Welcome to this webinar and conversation with a distinguished panel on California's school pension crisis. Who pays and what could be done? I'm Louis Friedberg, Executive Director of EdSource, here with my colleague John Fensterwald, and we'll be co-moderating the webinar. And just to clarify, this webinar is not a discussion about whether teachers and others should get pensions, but rather about how we're going to pay for them and the burden that the costs of the pensions are placing on both employers, employees, and the state. I wanted to thank West Ed for use of their facilities. A recording of this webinar and the presentations will be posted on our website, so you don't have to write everything down. And we do want to get your input, so please submit questions by clicking the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of your screens. We're also pleased to be presenting this webinar with our partner, Policy Analysis of California Education, PACE, as many of you know it. And this event was inspired by the rather remarkable Getting Down to Facts project, which I encourage all of you to look at, a series of research papers, not only on pensions, but on almost every other aspect of California education. And you can find them on a website, gettingdowntofacts.com, very easy to remember. And I should also mention that if you'd like to get EdSource's reports, both on the pension crisis and other issues on education reform in California, please sign up on our website at edsource.org. And last business arrangement, we'd like your feedback on our webinar today, so please take our short survey that will appear on your screen once the webinar is over. And so with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, John Fensterwald.
Thank you, Louis.
John.
So let's just jump in. Let me first introduce our panel. We're fortunate to have them today. Corey Cadell is Associate Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Missouri, and he's author of Pensions in California Schools, a study for the research project Getting Down to Facts, which Louis mentioned. Hello, Corey. Thank you. And we have Grant Boykin, who is Public Affairs Executive Officer of the California State Teachers Retirement System. Thank you for joining us, Grant.
Thank you.
Denise Bradford, President of the Saddleback Valley Educators Association, as of January 1st, a trustee of CalSTRS, representing pre-K through 12th grade educators. Thank you for joining us, Denise.
Good afternoon, thank you.
And we have Chad Alderman. Chad Alderman, Senior Associate Partner with Bellwether Education Partners, which is a national nonprofit focusing on education improvement. He also writes the blog teacherpensions.org. Thanks for joining us, Chad.
Thanks for having me.
So a word of caution, pension finance can be pretty complex. So please focus your attention for the next hour. And we've given our speakers a double challenge, which is to say, speak slowly and succinctly and hurry up because we have a lot to cover in an hour. I thought we would start off today with EdSource is creating an animated infographics that lays out the pension issues. So we're going to play the first 2 minutes of that to kind of be an explainer for where we will be heading after that.
California teachers, principals, and other school employees hope for a secure retirement. But the cost of paying for their pensions has soared and will rise further for at least several years. Despite increased state funding, many school districts find themselves in a tough balancing act. As pension costs have grown, they've taken up a bigger portion of the new money that districts have gotten every year. Pension costs are an obligation, not an option. To pay for pensions and other increased costs, some districts are canceling new programs like art, computer labs, or summer school, or not growing the programs they wanted to grow. Other districts are laying off teachers or giving smaller raises. Why is this happening? Most people can count on getting Social Security. Maybe they also have a 401k type retirement program. But teachers and administrators in California are not in the Social Security system. They get a defined benefit pension, a guaranteed retirement income based on how long they worked and what they earned. Take Gloria, who plans to retire when she's 60 this year. Having taught for 33 years, she'll be entitled to a $60,000 per year pension, which is 2/3 of her final $90,000 annual pay. Gloria's pension and those of other teachers are paid by the California State Teachers Retirement System, or CalSTRS. CalSTRS pays benefits from a big pool of money that's fed by contributions, money from teachers and administrators' pay, money from school districts' budgets, and money from California's general fund. CalSTRS invests these contributions, and the income that is generated is fed back into the pool.
Corey, why don't you start us off, if you will, with some background and some information about the pension dilemma from your Getting Down to Facts study?
Sure. Thanks, John. So I should have some slides coming up here in a second. I guess I'll just start talking here while the slides come up. So I was asked to give a quick overview of the work we did as part of the Getting Down to Facts project. So I'm just going to hit a couple of the big points from our report, and there's other information in there, of course. And I should mention the report is joint work with Gabriel Gassman, who's a student here at the University of Missouri with me. So this first chart looks like got a little expanded on the horizontal axis, so that's okay. This is just showing you contribution rates to CalSTRS, which is the pension plan that covers certified workers in public schools. So that's the teachers and administrators and those folks. There's a separate plan, CalPERS, for other workers in the schools, but CalSTRS is the main, is the big budget item for schools in terms of pensions. And so this is just showing you the contribution rate over time. The total height of the bars there is the total contribution rate to the plan. And so back in the early period, we started in 2006, just to give us a nice runway to see what's going on. The total contribution rate was about 18% of teacher salaries. The colors of the bars indicate the fraction of payments from different sources. So in California, employees pay, so you can just think of that as being the teachers. Employers would be the school districts, and the state of California makes a separate payment. And then for the picture here, I have two different colors for the state, which I'll come back to in a second. Basically, what's going on, and I think a big reason for this webinar, is pension costs are rising rapidly, and that's because of legislation that was passed in 2014, Assembly Bill 1469, and the school years at the bottom there are labeled by the spring year of the school year, so you can see the legislation kick in there in 2015. There was a flat contribution rate for teachers of about 18% of salaries going into 2015, and there's this phased increase. The initial target was about 35% total in terms of pension contributions this is a percent of teacher salaries when the legislation was introduced. And so you can see those bars going up near there. And then there's another piece of the legislation is there are these variable rates that kick in if plan finances are, depending on how plan financiers are doing. And so plan finances haven't been doing quite as well as they predicted in 2014. And so the state variable rate has been going up, and that's the yellow piece of those bars there. So the current projection is by 2024, rates will plateau at, you can see it there, about 37 or 38% of teacher salaries. And the projection is that will last through 2046. And I'll come back in a minute to talk about the thoughts around some of these long-term projections. So that's a pretty big increase. We can go to the next slide. So that's the what of what's going on here and why we're all here. I think a slide might have got missed. There we go. Great. So that's what's happening. Why is this happening? There's lots of layers of the onion when it comes to pension finance. I'm gonna go 2 layers deep. The first layer is just the 2-word answer is pension debt. The main reason this is happening is CalSTRS has a lot of pension debt. This is true for CalPERS also, but benefits are not going up. This is a pension debt problem. Going 1 layer further in the onion, why is there so much pension debt? There are 2 big reasons. The first is that the contributing parties in California have consistently underpaid for their pensions. So the actuaries have this thing they call the annual required contribution, and that's basically what the actuaries calculate is needed to pay for the plan. And for a very long time, California has been underpaying this annual required contribution, the ARC. So it's like receiving a credit card bill every month and just not paying it off in full. California's been doing that for a very long time. And so a big balance is built up, and there's a lot of debt that needs to be paid down. The other issue is, I think it's fair to say there's a consensus among financial economists that what the actuaries say they need to fund the plan isn't enough. And so even if the full ARC was being paid, the plan would still be accruing debt. And there's plenty of examples of other states across the country where the ARC has been paid in full and there are still debt problems. And so those are the two reasons that all this debt has accrued in the system. So now we go to the next slide, which will quickly show the history of underpayment into CalSTRS, at least in recent history. So this chart picks up in 2006. Again, there's nothing special about 2006 other than I wanted a little bit of a runway here. And the purple bar, so it only goes through 2017. It could be updated for 1 year now, but this is actual, this is showing you the actual annual required contribution the pension plan calculates, and then the actual contribution rate that is made to the plan. And the purple bars in this picture are the same as the bars I showed you 2 slides ago. So that's what's actually been contributed. You can see the totally flat trajectory through 2014, and then the phase in of the higher rate starting in 2015, and then we're partway through the phase in there by 2017. The green bars are what the actuaries say they need to fund the plan. And so you can see every year since 2006, California's been underpaying the ARC. It actually goes back further than that. These are big underpayments, and I just want to emphasize that. You can see the ARC jump a few times there, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if folks are interested. The big gaps later on in the picture make the gaps at the beginning look kind of small, but I would argue those aren't that small. So even back in 2006, the actuaries were saying they needed about 22% of teacher salaries, but only 18% of salaries was being put in. And so you do that over a very long period of time, and you're going to accumulate a lot of debt. And of course, in recent years, debt accumulation has increased. Okay.
And Corey, just remind us what ARC stands for again.
Sorry, that's the annual required contribution. That's what the actuaries say they need to fund the plan.
Thanks, great.
That's your credit card bill. And then the purple is how much is being paid. Okay. So then last slide here. So what's the long-term outlook? These higher rates that are being phased in, we're currently in the middle of phasing in here under current law, and assuming all actuarial assumptions hold, are going to be in place through 2046. So this is a long-term issue. If actuarial projections are too optimistic, which I think is likely, that's again something we could talk more about in Q&A. There's only 2 options. One is even higher contribution rates are going to be required, or 2046 is not going to be a sufficient time period by which to get rates back down. So that's it. Thanks.
And thank you. Corey, in your study, you had a provocative phrase: California has dug itself into a hole with CalSTRS, a hole that cannot be refilled. Is that referring to ARC? I mean, to the annual required contributions? Tell us why that seems like a dire forecast.
I guess that's just meant to say that we can't go back and undo what's already happened. We've already built up all this debt, and like anyone who accrues a bunch of debt, we can't make that go away. What we can do looking forward is do things so that we accrue less debt. And in fact, these rate increases, these contribution rate increases, are trying to get us there. I think there's some headwinds, but the main point of that was just that this problem that's been created is not going to go away. The hole has already been dug.
All right, thank you.
And just a quick question, Corey. We did get a question whether this data is this similar to CalPERS? This was for CalSTRS, right?
This is for CalSTRS. So we spend less time in the report on CalPERS. CalPERS has substantively similar problems. The numbers are different, but CalPERS also has accrued a fairly large amount of debt, and the projections are they're going to have big rate increases here for a while as well.
All right, thanks. Grant, let's turn to you. I think you're a little bit more optimistic about the future. So give us CalSTRS perspective, if you will.
Certainly. First, Corey, thanks for your work, and thanks EdSource for inviting us to have this forum. I just wanted to say that you're highlighting the issue of CalSTRS funding, and that as fiduciaries of the system, that's our primary focus. It's what we look at. And kind of wish, Corey, you had been doing your work about 15 years ago, because we were beating the same drum about the need for more adequate funding for the system. And so I'll go into the funding plan very soon and how that meets our system's funding needs. But I thought it's important to first start with the slide that shows a snapshot of what CalSTRS employees actually earn at retirement. I'm going to have you look at mainly at the lower right-hand corner. It's 55.7% is the income that they replace compared to their income that they earned prior to retirement. Most financial planners would argue that 80 to 90% is a pretty good benchmark. It's important to keep in mind too that CalSTRS members don't pay into Social Security. So unless they have personal savings, the CalSTRS defined benefit is pretty much their primary source of income. Could I have the next slide, please? And one other thing that I wanted to mention is with an average tenure that exceeds that of most California or most public sector employees, California teachers earn a relatively modest benefit. And about 70% are female, and most research shows that females fare worse than males in retirement. So this chart that I'm showing here shows our historical funding picture, and for most of our history, we've been a pay-as-you-go plan. So if you're arguing we're digging a hole now that we can't dig out of, look at where we were. We've been around for 106 years. So this chart only starts in 1975, so we've had bigger holes. But it's really since the 70s that we've started to pre-fund. And if you look at the dashed line, what the dashed line shows is that with the implementation of our funding plan, we're projected to get to full funding. I wish I had redone this chart, because without that funding plan, that dashed line would go exactly in the opposite direction, down to 0 by 2046. But we do have a funding plan in place. And unlike most pension plans, CalSTRS doesn't have the authority to change contribution rates, or it hasn't. We have limited flexibility now under the funding plan. And it had been almost 3 decades since employer contributions or school district contributions had been increased. And we had been arguing the need for a funding plan for over 10 years before this was put in place in 2014. And the funding plan itself was a result of legislative action. It was an open, transparent process, as legislation is, brought all parties to the table. And what it resulted in was a shared responsibility that required increased contributions from members, our teachers, from school districts, and also from the state. And it established gradual school district increases that are predictable and allowed districts to plan and to budget for those increases. So yes, it was by design that we're underfunding the ARC in the early years to get to the level that districts need to. Next slide, please. Actually, I missed something. So as I said before, for most of our 106-year history, we've been a pay-as-you-go system, very underfunded, and still we've never missed a benefit payment. So at a time when we actually have a statutory framework in place to get us to full funding, and our projections show that we'll get to full funding, it seems a little bit a little bit of an exaggeration to say there's a crisis. I know that drives people to a webinar to call it a crisis. And it's important to note that when the funding plan increased contributions for members, it's only the districts and the state that are on the hook for investment volatility to pay for the unfunded liability. And it's really the state who bears the brunt of the investment volatility. So some of your earlier work has conflated 2 pieces of legislation. One is our funding plan. The other is the PEPRA, our Pension Reform Act, that was put in place in 2012 by Governor Brown. And that does require new employees hired after 2012 to pay part of what's called the normal cost, which is the annual cost of paying the benefit, regardless of the unfunded liability or a surplus we might have. And so their costs, like for example, a couple of years ago, we changed our mortality improvement assumptions and our investment return assumption, and their costs did change because of that, but it's not because of the unfunded liability. It's because of the cost of the benefit. So the slide that I have up here, I wanted to put in here because some of Corey's work has questioned some of the actuarial assumptions we use to determine plan funding. In particular, one of those assumptions is the investment return assumption. And I just wanted to show that in terms of corporate plans, that first line on the slide shows that corporate plans expect about a 6.8 investment return. Public plans, about 7.2%. CalSTRS is right in the middle of that mix. There's a difference between discount rate and investment return assumption, but the point I wanted to make is that we're right there. We do happen to use our investment return assumption as our discount rate. And then finally, next slide, please. So much has been written about the idea that pension costs are really the driver of California school budget problems. And I'm not going to argue they're not. You know, we have budget problems. That's why we needed the funding plan. Schools have budget problems. That is clear. But this is data from our legislative analyst office. It's an independent body that analyzes the state budget for the legislature. And if you look on the left side, it shows that school districts' pension contributions for both their CalSTRS teacher members and their non-certificated members to CalPERS have increased by 4.1 billion since our funding plan was put in place. During that same time, the funding for schools in the aggregate has increased 5 times of that. So, you know, this data has led some of our journalists in California to suggest that the pension issue is a bit of a red herring when it comes to school budget issues. And the last thing I wanted to do is just conclude by noting that research has shown that dollar for dollar defined benefit plans are really the most efficient way to achieve retirement security. When public employees have a choice between a defined benefit plan and a defined contribution plan, they overwhelmingly choose defined benefit plan. And there are examples, there's empirical evidence from states like Michigan or West Virginia that have shown when they've tried an alternative like a defined contribution plan, it hurts the existing plan, it drives up costs dramatically, and it hurts the retirement security of existing teachers. So that's why I believe strongly that in CalSTR's mission to administer a defined benefit plan that will secure the financial future of California educators. Thank you. I'll finish now.
I just had a quick question, a very obvious one. You've been listening to Grant Boykin from CalSTRS. Why are teachers not part of the Social Security system? I get that question a lot.
Yeah, so that's a history that goes way back to when certain public employees were allowed to opt out. I'm not the expert on that, but a long time ago in California, certain public sector employees, including teachers, about half of CalPERS members, more on the state safety side, or on the safety, the police and firefighters, have opted out of Social Security. And the rationale at the time was if you have a government pension, maybe you can opt out of Social Security and your pension will take care of what Social Security needs would be. But it's a decision that took place decades ago, and I don't have the history to explain exactly what the rationale is.
Maybe Denise Bradford when we get to her.
Well, let's turn to a teacher, Denise Bradford, who is president of the Saddleback Valley Educators Association, and soon, as of January, will be a member of the trustees of CalSTRS in making very critical decisions that we're talking about. So Denise, tell us, why is a defined benefit pension important to teachers, and give us your thoughts, if you will.
So I think you'll find I have a very different perspective. I thought I would first speak a little bit about my own experience and expectations for retirement. I've been an elementary school teacher for over 25 years. You've heard I'm a local president. I'm also the chair of the retirement committee for the California Teachers Association. And as the chair, I'm a liaison to CalSTRS, and that's how I found my way to running for the board. In my many varied roles, I've had the opportunity to speak with thousands of educators. Not surprisingly, many of them share my story. At some point in our lives, a colleague or maybe a family member who is a teacher explained that teacher salaries are barely adequate, but if you can manage, your pension will make up for it. Look at your pension as deferred compensation. I think this point is missed a lot. It will be modest, but you'll have a secure retirement. In my case, if I retire at 55, I would receive $3,500 a month. It has taken me 25 years to work through the steps and columns of the salary schedule, adding a master's degree to earn $100,000 a year. Just as a matter of comparison, my 29-year-old daughter, who also has a master's degree, is already at the $90,000 mark in private industry. Despite the wage discrepancy, As I look at my pay stub and I calculate what the district and the state have contributed to my retirement, I feel somewhat better. Keep in mind that my district only contributed 8.25% for most of my career. What many people do not realize is that I also contribute over 10% of my gross salary to retirement. As a teacher, I am thankful that I'll be rewarded with a modest but secure retirement. But as we were talking about, this will be my only retirement, as California educators do not participate in Social Security. That also translates to, I will not be able to collect my late husband's Social Security benefits. As we've heard, a defined benefit pension is unequivocally the best choice for career educators. Switching to an account-based retirement system would sharply reduce the retirement income security of teachers, and therefore would also in the long term hurt the state of California. And if you've had a chance to read my slide, you can see in this economic impact study by the University of the Pacific, most notably, it shows how retiree spending positively impacts the California economy. This study notes of the $2.4 billion that the state contributes to CalSTRS, the state and local governments receive back a 50-cent return on each dollar via taxes. In addition to the CalSTRS pension rewarding teachers, 72% of which are women, with a modest but secure retirement, it also serves as a potent retention and recruiting tool. Sadly, since the Great Recession, enrollment in teacher prep programs is way down. A national survey by UCLA found that only 4.2% of students entering college plan to pursue a career in education. This is down from the historical average of 10%. I would argue that we want the best teachers for California students, and if we don't change the narrative around teacher pensions, it is going to be very difficult to recruit and retain teachers. What I have not heard mentioned today is the real overriding issue: school funding. Pensions are just one piece and a fractional piece. The systemic issue we are facing is the systemic underfunding of public education. Schools are funded at a fraction of the true cost of special education from both the federal and the state government, while we are facing increases in the number of special education students. Utilities and pension costs have also increased, but what we do not hear is the cumulative impact these increased costs have. What we typically hear is a skewed perspective that the entire reason schools are facing a fiscal crisis is because of those expensive teachers and their elaborate pensions. That is just not true. Teachers are the ones on the front line fighting for our children's educational future, literally saving children from fires, bullets, and on the picket lines. Yet these discussions treat our contributions to the system of support as something that is disposable and of no value. Women's economic contributions and opportunities have been systematically limited. These pension attacks are simply the latest tool being used to eliminate any retirement security during our retirement years with no safety net. In the end, the taxpayer is paying for the services provided for those taxes. The pension cost is part of the cost of the services. The bigger picture to me is that California, although the 5th largest economy in the world, ranks only in the middle of the per pupil spending on education. Voters and policymakers need to decide if education is being funded appropriately. In my final slide, I would like to give, can you change the slide, please? Thanks. In my final slide, I would like to give a big picture overview of California and retirement security. According to these statistics by UC Berkeley, in general, women do not have an adequate retirement, nor do enough of our California households have a plan for retirement. I would argue, according to these statistics, instead of trying to take pensions away, we should be creating retirement security for all. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much for your perspective, Denise. So Chad Alderman of Bellwether Education Partners, you have a bit of a different perspective on the teachers' pensions, both from observations in California and your work in other states. Go ahead and give us your thoughts, please.
Sure. So I run a website called teacherpensions.org, trying to raise awareness about how pensions work for teachers. We do some work on California as well. So I'm going to talk a little about the benefit structure. We talked a lot about costs, but talk a little about benefits as well. A number of studies have looked at California benefits and how they accrue over time. And what they found is that teachers must serve for many years before they qualify for decent retirement benefits. And there's different estimates on exactly how that works, but CalSTRS funded paper found that for a 30-year-old entrant, so a new teacher who's 30 years old, they would have to stay for 18 to 25 years before their pension formula was worth more than cost-neutral alternative plans. And the 18 to 25 gives the range of different types of comparisons. Another paper looked at how many people that affects. And so if you think about 30-year-old entrants, 40-year-old entrants, 50-year-old entrants in the profession, how many people would surpass that break-even point? And the paper found that about 2/3 of California teachers who come into the profession are getting benefits that are worth less than the plan's normal cost of benefits. So if you think back to what the slide that Corey gave, this is the cost that the system thinks it actually costs to provide the benefits. That's not even as much as the unfunded liability costs. And so that disadvantages anyone who leaves in a short period of time. If you think about schools or positions that have higher turnover are going to be more likely in that 2/3. Places with more stability, higher pay, positions like superintendents and principals tend to be in that 1/3 of the people who do pretty well under the current system. We've talked a little about Social Security, but these findings are also exacerbated by the fact that California doesn't offer its teachers Social Security benefits. And so if their teachers are leaving without adequate benefits from CalSTRS, they don't have anything else. And so it's a double problem in California. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide, I'm going to talk a little about whether pensions are a recruitment and retention incentive. Some of this comes straight from California. Some of it comes from other states and other pension systems. There's a great study looking at when states increase their employee contribution rates, does that factor into a new would-be teacher's decision about whether to enter the profession or not? And they found it did not. It wasn't part of their calculation. Same with vesting. CalSTRS has a 5-year vesting period, and when we looked at teachers' behavior in California, there's not a group of 4-year teachers that stick around just to meet their vesting at 5 years. What that means to me is that there are other factors like salary, geography, working conditions that are more likely to drive a teacher's decision about how long to stay in the profession. At the back end, so that is people who are potentially entering and once they're early in their career. But at the back end, there is a pull and push effect for veteran teachers. There's definitely a pull effect that keeps teachers in as they're nearing their retirement age. They know the 2% at 60 or 2% at 62 formula, and they do pay attention to that. And they're very sensitive to those changes as well. But this is pretty late in a teacher's career. If you think about someone who's 56, 57, who's nearing their retirement age, they're very salient. It's right in front of them. They know what's on the horizon. But we've seen from other states that it's not as influential to someone who's 30, 40, even in their 50s. It also can push out people who might want to consider teaching for longer, but because of the financial nudge, it essentially gives them a push, a reason to retire at 60 or 62, and they might want to continue teaching. In California also had a study looking at what happened when the state enhanced benefits in the late 1990s, and it did change teachers' behavior slightly, but for a cost to the state of about $250 million, it nudged teachers' retirements about 4 months later. So really not a big change for a pretty large cost. And so my conclusion on this is that if pension plans are not much of a retention incentive, that means we should doubly focus on making sure they're meeting the needs of workers, and we should focus the retirement plans for workers, not for employers. Go to one more slide. And there are a variety of different ways that California could better meet the needs of workers and employers. So CalSTRS already offers what's called a cash balance plan that defines benefits in terms of a guaranteed rate of return, and it can be more portable than the current system. It's often better for short and medium-term workers. It's not designed to be a standalone benefit right now, but it could be tweaked and improved. Similarly, the University of California used to offer a standalone pension plan, largely for cost reasons. It shifted new hires after 2016 into a defined contribution plan. That's a pretty good plan. Its employees contribute 7%. The university system contributes 8%. The employer contributions vest after 1 year, which means they can take them with them. And there's a good mix of low fee, age appropriate funds. So I'll just turn that over and again, I'll conclude my remarks by saying that CalSTRS should be designing their benefit system to provide all workers with adequate retirement systems and retirement benefits. Occasionally we start talking about full career workers only, and I think that it's a better approach to look at someone who has 5 years, 15 years, 30 years, and making sure that everyone who serves in the system gets adequate nest eggs that's appropriate to the time that they served.
Okay, boy, we got a lot of really provocative questions and comments, I would say, but I just wanted to get Corey Cadell's reaction to Grant Boykin. He says it's not a crisis. A lot depends on how you define a crisis, but what was your reaction to that, Corey?
I guess my reaction is I think it is a crisis for schools. I think a lot of schools are really struggling with this. You put up the slide that there's, the $21 billion increase in funding and, $4 billion or so in pensions. And yeah, 21's a lot bigger than 4, but pensions is a very small part, should be a very small part of total school costs. And so I actually think that's a pretty substantial share of the cost in schools. In California, as a lot of folks probably on the webinar know, have funding levels were way down in California, and they're sort of just trying to get caught up to where they were pre-recession. So my sense is that for schools, this is actually quite a big problem.
Grant, you mentioned in one of your slides that pension contributions to date would be about $4 billion of CalPERS and CalSTRS, and the increases are supposed to go through 2020-21. Could you project ahead? What would the contributions from districts look like at that time? And then the panel, what happens after that? What happens after 2021?
Sure, just to react to Corey's last comment. So pension costs are a percent of payroll, and for schools, their budget is largely payroll. It's the people, it's the teachers who teach. But in terms of and one other thing on Social Security issue, I kind of had a freeze for a moment. When Social Security was set up in 1930s, it was not for public sector workers. In the 50s, public sector could opt in or out. But at that time, California teachers decided, after looking at it, that they would do disability and survivor benefits through CalSTRS and opted out. But in terms of what through the life of the funding plan, employer contributions, which are right now at 16.28% of payroll, they are projected to, under the funding plan, rise to, for school districts, 19.1% of payroll in July 1, 2020. But then the first year we have flexibility to adjust those rates, which is July 1, 2021, we're actually projecting that for school employers, that'll go down to 18.2%. And so that's what we're projecting. But Governor Newsom has a budget proposal which would give $6 billion to CalSTRS, $3 billion would be for rate relief for the schools. So you can take whatever figure we expect in the out years and take 0.5% off of that through 2046. And then under the legislation at 2046, schools would go back to the 8.25% of payroll that they originally had before the funding plan was in place.
And Grant, you mentioned Governor Newsom's proposal, which I'm sure many of you who are watching are familiar with. We did get a question of how significant is that? How much relief is that really going to be providing?
I think it's very significant for school districts who have been talking about, even though they knew about the funding plan and we have a schedule in place, they have been talking about the crunch of increased contributions. So for the first 2 years, Governor Newsom's plan would take the school contribution and reduce it by 1% for those first 2 years. And then in the out years.
Just to clarify, 1% doesn't sound that much. But
Well,
that's significant.
if you're a school district like LAUSD, for example, the second school district in the country, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but that's millions of dollars right there. So it's hard to say that that's not significant.
It's about $60 per student, I believe, each year is what's been projected.
Well, I think you have to be careful when you're talking about the per pupil numbers, because some of the work you put out earlier conflated per pupil. It made a reach in talking about per pupil numbers by conflating member contributions and state contributions, and most states don't act as sponsors and contribute to teacher plans and school district contributions. So our per pupil numbers are quite a bit different than the ones that you had out earlier this week.
So we wanted to know, we've talked about how important it is, the rate of return on investments, because that in fact drives most of the payments. There's been a lot of people think that it's still too high, that the rate needs to come down, the projected rate of what CalSTRS will earn on its investments. And I'm interested what others think. And then if in fact it were lowered, what would the impact then be on contributions in the future?
And who are you directing that question to?
Anyone.
I'd be happy to take that really quickly. So we have a process every 4 years where we examine our asset allocation. We have outside experts, actuaries, investment consultants looking at, the first step is coming up this spring, looking at capital market assumptions. What's private equity going to return in over 10, 20, 30 years? What's public equity is going to return? And then after all that data comes in and we look at our risk tolerance, we figure out what our asset allocation should be and what our target is. And, you know, for example, just University of Missouri has a return assumption of 7.5%. I can't, sitting from the seat where I am in West Sacramento, opine on whether is that too high, is that too low, without knowing their liabilities, their asset mix. It's got to be individual for each system, but there has to be a process, and that's why we review it every few years.
Anyone else care to comment on that?
I'll just jump in real quick, and then I know the other panelists probably won't want to get in here on stuff. But so I think Grant and I mostly agree to disagree, which I think is fine, but I think the rate is too high. And I feel like it was a little misleading to show the private sector plans, because those plans have basically gone away. And a lot of it, in my view, is because these benefits are not affordable. The other thing I'll say, which is, you know, Missouri likes company, so I don't know how this fits in, but, you know, the plans across the country, public defined benefit plans, are struggling. And so it's not just like California's in some unique situation. And a lot of the plans, the biggest reason identified in research is not meeting the assumed rate of return on assets. And so I think at least among financial economists, there's not a lot of argument about that number being too high.
And what would happen though if the rate were lowered? Wouldn't that lead to higher contributions?
That's right. So the way an economist would say it is you would be, yeah, contributions would go up because with the higher rate, we're not paying the full price. And so it would push us more toward paying the full price, factoring in the risk.
Yeah. And by the way, Grant, I wasn't trying to diminish at $60 per student a savings next year. I think districts are very happy to get that $60 back and $60 the year after that.
Right. Thanks.
So let's turn to the future and solutions. What might be done to either mitigate the costs or other options? We've talked perhaps about a 401k as one option that I think Denise feels the teacher would not be in teachers' interest. But as part of our EdSource video, we sort of sum up the options. So let's go back and look at that, if we will.
What else can be done? Along with agreeing with Newsom's payments, lawmakers could fund more of CalSTRS debt in the future, although that would leave less money for other state needs like childcare and fire prevention. Another idea is that lawmakers could go further and switch pensions from new workers to a 401k type plan, where they would assume the risk and costs. Or lawmakers could also give current workers the option of converting future earnings to a 401k type plan. But that would happen only if the California Supreme Court decides that pension rules can be changed for previously hired workers, as urged by former Governor Jerry Brown. Or lawmakers could increase school funding at a faster pace, which would require the state to raise taxes. These are tough choices, But perhaps none is tougher than the cost of inaction. Tell Governor Newsom, lawmakers, and your school board what you think. A lot is at stake.
So we had an actual Supreme Court decision this week in a case that was called Cal Fire versus CalPERS. And I wonder if one of the panelists like to talk about that case, its implications now, or perhaps other decisions coming along, and how might that change things?
Denise, do you have thoughts on the ruling?
Yeah, that's not my forte. Grant, you want to go for that?
Well, I mean, so CalSTRS as an organization, I think, is still absorbing the ruling that came out, but I think it's, what we've read is it's pretty much as expected. This was not the case to challenge the California rule, and that's been relatively left intact. And just for those who don't know what the California rule is, it's our vested rights doctrine in California and many other states actually that says at the time you're hired, benefits can't be changed even for future benefits. Once you're hired, the benefits in place are the benefits that you have. And I would also argue, studies show that, 401k can be cheaper, but not for the same level of benefit. And there are efficiencies with pooling that you get in a defined benefit, and the longer time horizon you get with a pooled plan, that 401k just can't match that.
Well, let me just go back to you, Denise. I think when in your slides earlier, you suggested you didn't think 401k was the way to go. But this would be for new teachers coming in. What's your take on that?
My take is, like I said, we consider our pension part of our deferred compensation. And I don't think of a 401k, you can predict that you're going to have a secure retirement. I think I like to be able to go on my little calculator on my calstrs.com and put in my age and the factor and how many years I want to work and play with the different scenarios and know that it's going to be there. Teachers are not great about, I want to say investing, I guess would be the best thing. And we see that by how many people don't even add a 403b to their pension, which really we should all have right now. I think that shows you that it's just simplified, that we just all take care of it in our paycheck and we know what to expect.
So Chad, or
can I jump in a little bit? Yeah. So one, I will stick up for defined contribution plans. I think they can be structured in a way that is beneficial for workers. The UC plan I mentioned has pretty good contribution rates. It has automatic enrollment. It has very good low fee index funds that are tailored to a worker's age, so they don't have to make a lot of decisions if they aren't prepared to. So there are ways to structure it, DC plans, defined contribution plans, in a way that is worker friendly. But even then, there are other options as well. So I pointed to the CalSTRS cash balance plan. There are other states that offer cash balance plans to their workers, which are legally a defined benefit, but they define the benefit in terms of a guaranteed rate of return rather than a formula. The formula tends to be backloaded, whereas the cash balance plan tends to be more steady accrual over time. So Texas municipal plans are enrolling 300,000 public servants across Texas in cash balance plans. Nebraska has one for its state employees. Kansas has one for its teachers. There are other options other than just a straight 401k style plan.
So why would it switch to that system, assuming the state is generous in its contributions to teachers? Why would that help districts at all in their obligations?
Yeah, let me start. I think everyone on this panel would agree that the current liabilities are there and they cannot be assumed away. Even changing plans for new workers doesn't solve that problem. What it does is that it stops accruing those unfunded liabilities in the future. So if you shifted to a defined contribution or even a cash balance plan, you would largely cap that risk going forward. And the current workers, current retirees would still pay into it, the state would still pay into it, but you wouldn't have that pending obligation that keeps rolling forward in the future.
Yeah, Corey, I think you mentioned in the start that after 2021, it's actually the state that would be on the hook, this variable rates that, in fact, if expectations aren't met, their contribution, the state's contributions would increase, but not necessarily districts. Am I right there?
Yeah, and I think Grant mentioned this too. So the way the legislation is set up, different parties are subject to different types of risk from the plan, and all three parties have their different risk segments. But yeah, the state is most at risk if the finances are not going as well in the plan. And you can see that already starting to emerge in the recent actuarial projections. And that was that little yellow bar in my slides. The state rate has been going up more than anybody else on the variable side.
Just, we have a question here from Sheldon. He says, will local governments begin to play a bigger role in school finance and thus pension funding as cities and schools partner more on curricular and extracurricular services? Not sure how that would work, but any response, any relief from some other?
That seems a bit outside of CalSTR's lane. We administer a pension benefit for California educators. So.
Grant, you mentioned that the PEPRA, as the reform law is called, affects new teachers differently from those who were in existence before the 2013 law. So as new teachers join the workforce, what impact would that have then on obligations over the next decade or two?
Yeah, good question. So we do have about, it's very close to a quarter of our teachers now are subject to the new benefits under PEPRA. We call it, this is complex, is why this is hard to do in a 1-hour webinar, but the 2% at 62 benefit is the PEPRA members. So 2% of your salary times service at age 62 versus the pre-PEPRA members, which are 2% at 60. So they have a slightly less generous benefit. So actuarially that costs less. And so going forward through attrition, we're just building every year more of these kind of PEPRA members that have a lesser benefit and have less liabilities that they accrue.
Is it possible that, in fact, well, can we come to expect that the state may continue to recognize the challenges that districts are facing with additional increases in their contributions? Do you think we can count on the state coming in and continue to help in the future? And I've been told maybe one possibility is to use excess revenue from the rainy day fund, for example, as a continual help for districts. Is this being discussed?
I will just jump in and say that we're happy with the funding plan that was passed in 2014. It works, it's working. But we were very pleased when Governor said, you know what, I'm going to give some rate relief to schools and I'm going to pay down the state's unfunded liability a little bit quicker. We're kind of agnostic about that, except that, you know, we're happy that it happened, but we aren't asking for it. And we don't have any expectations about what this or a future governor's administration might do with the rainy day fund or other funds.
Can I just put one point on that, and maybe Corey would chime in too, is that the slide that Corey put up, the contributions after they increase are scheduled to be at that level through the year 2046. So, and that's assuming CalSTR's current assumptions are all correct on mortality, investment returns, et cetera. And so there is a lot of risk either side. I think the risk to the state or the funding is that, you know, if those assumptions are off, if the returns come in at 6.75% as opposed to 7%, like that's a big problem for the state that will get funneled down either through higher contribution rates or other things. And it's very sensitive. Even a small miss can be a big deal. Also, it's even a small miss for a given period of time. So essentially, the timing of the returns also matters. There's a great piece in the New York Times by Neil Irwin a couple of years ago looking at the timing of returns, and it can matter when returns are actually put in place as opposed to, like, you can take a 30-year average, but different pockets and periods can matter for the state funding as well.
We're looking at the clock. We have about 3 minutes left, and we're going to ask each of you. I'm just going to go around very, very, very quickly from where you are sitting, and you know, briefly, obviously, what is the number one thing that you think should be done to tackle this issue that obviously you're all is hugely expert on? I'm going to start with Corey. What do we do first?
I think eventually there'll have to be structural reform to these plans because it's just too easy to accrue debt. And I think put me down 50 years from now, we're going to have seen a huge shift away from these defined benefit plans as happened in the private sector, just because we can't find, in principle, we should be able to manage them, but we can't seem to avoid the moral hazard and the debt accumulation.
Major reform, you're saying, of the system.
Yeah, to be more specific, shift toward defined contribution benefits.
Denise Bradford.
So I'm going to say that we stay the course that we have set, because just as everyone has a crystal ball that everything is going to get worse and worse, the crystal ball sometimes gets better with the state willing to contribute. And we want to keep teachers teaching. Everybody's still missing the deferred compensation part. I understand that my district is paying more for my benefits, but in exchange, I've taken a less of a pay raise over the past since 2008. Since the Great Recession. So I would say stay the course and let's keep teachers teaching.
Stay the course. Okay, Chad Alderman from Bellwether Partners.
Yeah, I'm with Corey in the long term. I think in the short term, I would like to see the state give teachers a choice. So if they don't know how long they're going to stay, or if they know they're only going to stay 5 or 10, 15 years, give them a retirement plan that's more suited to them than opposed to sticking them in the more backloaded system that currently exists.
And Grant Boykin from CalSTRS, you're handling this whole issue on a daily basis. What's the one thing that
and I would say that I've been in this space for almost 20 years, and in that 2 decades, every year we've had reform. Investment return assumptions have gone down, benefit levels have gone down, actuarial methods have gotten more conservative. And I think that we're at a good place now, but what we need to do is keep what we are doing, and every year review our assumptions, review our funding methodology, and make it open and transparent. And you know, like I said, it says our mission statement is our badge, and it's securing the funding, the retirement security of California's educators, and that's what we're committed to with the funding that we do. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity, and thanks everyone for participating.
Well, thank you. We got kind of a split panel there on stay the course or keep going. Probably some reform the whole system. Probably going to have to be somewhere in the middle. But one of you asked, will this discussion be online? Will the slides be online? We will be putting that up shortly, so you can go back and look at it. We didn't get to all your questions, but we'll forward these to the panelists, and maybe we can answer some of these, because it is usually complicated, but I think this has been a hugely enlightening discussion. I want to thank you all for joining us, and for all of you who are watching and listening, for all the work you are doing. You're all working in the trenches. And so thank you for the work that you do. Thanks to our partner at PACE, and thanks again to West Ed for allowing us to use their facilities. We see this as part of a beginning of a conversation, and not the end of it.
It's been a pleasure. We thank you for participating, and we thank all of the viewers for spending an hour looking at this very difficult, complex subject.